This is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Tim Buszard, postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Sport, Exercise and Active Living and Tennis Australia. Hi everyone, welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Tim Buszard. Tim received his PhD in skill acquisition from Victoria University in 2014 and has since been working there as a postdoc, conducting lots of research on skill acquisition that has both theoretical and applied value. He also recently started a great blog, which you can find at skillacquisition.wordpress.com. In the interview, we discuss his blog and other topics including scaling sports equipment appropriately for kids, working memory capacity and its role in implementing coaching instructions, and whether contextual interference has value outside the lab. Hope you enjoy!
Not 10 years ago, I was a child. I was a good boy and you let me go. Now I'm on a talk show.
Today my guest is Tim Buszard from Victoria University in Australia. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Tim.
Awesome. No, thank you. Thank you, Rob.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in sports science?
Yeah, I suppose I'll take you back to 10 years ago, I suppose, when I finished year 12 and wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I knew I loved sport, but it was either going to be sports science or architecture. And the only reason I chose sports science was because there was less contact hours. And at the time, I still had ambitions to become a professional cricketer, a bit like a lot of people in the field. I think they have ambitions of becoming a professional sportsman. And so the less contact hours meant I could train a bit more. But shortly into my degree, I realised my ambitions were slowly fading. But fortunately, I was really loving the sports science course. And I slowly started to enjoy the study of skill acquisition and motor learning. And one of my lecturers at the time was Justin Kemp, who is good friends with Damien Farrow, who, as you know, is a skill acquisition specialist. And that led me down the path of doing an honours project in decision-making in football, and I absolutely loved it. It was a fantastic experience. It was my first introduction to research. That led me on to a PhD with Damien again, Victoria University in Tennis Australia. And once again, the more I got involved in research, I just really enjoyed it. I know some people don't enjoy their PhD experience, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think that largely came down to my supervisor. So, Damien was a great mentor. Mark Reed, who I'm not sure if you know, he works at Tennis Australia. He's very much an applied scientist. And so, I learned a lot from him about, we're talking about a research topic. How's this going to apply to, or how's this going to benefit the coach, or how's this going to benefit the athlete? Rich Masters was my other supervisor. And so, I learned a lot from him as well about research. One of the benefits of him as a supervisor was that he worked at Hong Kong University. And as a 22, 23-year-old, that was a fantastic place to visit and hang out with Rich and do research with him and meet people like Jamie Poulton, and Mark Wilson even visited there. So anyway, my whole PhD experience was fantastic. And since then, I got a postdoc with Damien again at Victoria University in Tennis Australia. And 3 years later, I'm still here, and I've certainly enjoyed the research experience. And with a bit of luck, I'll continue to do this.
That's great. It's great to hear such passion and positive attitude. Yeah. You're doing a lot of stuff. And where I wanted to start is to talk about this great blog that you've started, which is at skillacquisition.wordpress.com, right? So I wanted can you tell us a little bit about it and kind of what you're hoping to achieve with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose firstly, the website's called Skill Acquisition Research. I probably could have been a bit more creative with the name. I've thought about that. But anyway, I'll stick with that for now. And for those who haven't seen it, because there's probably quite a few, the website is simply about summarising studies, which I consider to be good studies, for coaches to read or teachers to read, and then they can take it away and either apply it or maybe they'll criticise and say, no, we won't apply this. But essentially it's trying to provide short summaries for coaches. The reason I did the website was because a few years ago I thought, I was thinking about this, and I jump onto Google and I try and find information about skill acquisition or motor learning for coaches to use. And I'm not sure if you've ever done this before, but it's really hard to find information, which is in comparison to fitness or strength and conditioning, where there's just loads of information out there. And I found that quite disappointing actually, because I was new to research, but I was thinking there's some quality work going on around the world. I think about the Quantify research going on by, Mark Wilson and Sam Vine and that crew, and then there's some great work in Canada by Joe Baker on talent ID, and even the work you're doing, Rob, with the under pressure and the batting simulator work. But then at the same time, I've got friends who are coaches who are engaged in coaching. They want to learn about coaching, and yet they're not really aware of a lot of this research that's going on. And so then I was like, okay, I was a bit disappointed as a researcher. I'm like, there's lots of really good work going on out there, but there's these coaches who are really engaged, but they're not actually aware of it. So that's where I thought, okay, maybe I can try and help this. I'm not sure if I am or not, but hopefully I can provide some short summaries for coaches to read, and then they can take it away and apply it if need be. So that was one of the key motivations. The other motivation was more of a selfish reason. I really like writing, which might sound really weird. If I tell my mates that, they might find it a bit weird. But I really like writing, and I want to improve my writing. So I figured the website was a great way to practice my writing skills. So that's essentially the two key reasons.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And I think you do a great job of, picking out the key points. And I was going to ask you kind of about the personal motivations too. And one of the things that I found, one of the things that I like about doing the podcast for me is it kind of forces me to read articles that otherwise I would go, I don't have time for that. So I didn't know if you have the same. It kind of helps motivate you to keep up on the literature.
Absolutely, actually. I found that since I've started, all of a sudden I'm not reading just the articles that are relevant to my research, but I'm reading about, at the moment, I've been reading a lot about coordination dynamics and that body of research, which otherwise I might have read here or there, but now I've just really enjoyed reading it. And I suppose it makes me read a lot of different areas that I might not actually be actively engaged in, and I really enjoy that. Yeah. It's certainly helped, I suppose, my understanding of the field.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, I definitely recommend people check it out. And so let's dive into some of your research. One of the things I wanted to talk about is you've done a lot of research on scaling sports equipment appropriately for kids. And so I wanted to ask you kind of what is the motivation for doing that, and what have you found in your research about its effectiveness?
Yeah, so scaling sports equipment, so using modified equipment for children, that was essentially the primary aim of my PhD. So I'll give you a very quick background of the motivation for it, or the reason for it. So my PhD was partially funded by Tennis Australia. Now in the tennis world, 10 years ago, the International Tennis Federation launched this big campaign called the Play and Stay campaign. The campaign was all about trying to get children all around the world to play tennis with smaller rackets, smaller courts, softer balls. Really good initiative, but it wasn't actually based on any evidence. There was no actual evidence to say whether this was going to be beneficial for children's skill development. So that was largely the key reason for my PhD, to try and test the effect of modified equipment on children's motor skills and learning. In terms of what we've found, it might sound common sense, but the initial studies were simply, when you provide children with a racket, a smaller racket and a softer ball, or equipment that's appropriately scaled for them, they perform the skills better, which makes sense. I mean, if you simplify the skill for children, they perform it better. Some of the other observations we've made, so when we just did a very simple subjective assessment of children's movement patterns or technique, what we observe is that when children use a softer ball, all of a sudden they strike the ball out in front of their body more often, okay, as opposed to a normal tennis ball, which might bounce higher and then, they strike it behind their body. So there's some really nice, I suppose, quite simple findings in terms of the effect of making a small modification to the equipment and how this affects children's, or the way they perform the skills. One of the big criticisms of, I suppose, the modified sport from coaches and from the public is that it can be detrimental to skilled players. So this led us down a path of examining skilled players essentially, and how does modified sport actually affect those with skill? So I'll touch on those studies if you like.
Yeah, definitely.
So we ran a couple of studies with the best 10-year-old tennis players in the country, and essentially one of those studies was looking at how does the modified ball affect match play. And so we got the best 10-year-olds. They played one match with a normal tennis ball, one match with a softer green ball. And what we observed was quite cool. What we observed was when children used the modified ball, all of a sudden they started to approach the net more often. They struck the ball at a comfortable height, so between their thighs and shoulders, as opposed to the normal ball, which bounces too high. And they actually had faster rallies, which is quite amazing given that the softer ball, travels slower through the air. But because it's softer, they started to hit it with more power, and essentially they started to demonstrate a more attacking style of play. The other study we did was looking at net height. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about net height before in tennis, but the adult net height is 91 centimeters. Now, for a professional tennis player, that's approximately 50% of their height. For a 8, 9, 10-year-old tennis player who plays on the same net height, that's about 70% of their height. And one of the coaches will always talk about one of the challenges with coaching juniors is that it's really hard to teach them the serve. It's the most complex of the skills to learn. And it makes sense when you think about it because they're serving to a net height that's, much higher relative to their height. So, to walk you through the study very quickly, we simply got the best 10-year-olds to play matches on a normal net height and then, a range of lower net heights. Now this study hasn't been published, so I probably should be careful before I start spoofing the results. I'll give you a very basic, one of the, observations we made. As soon as we lowered the net height, we saw some aces. Okay. And we never saw any aces on the normal net height. We also saw them serving, or there were more first serves in, I should say. In fact, the first serves in much more, or it started to mirror a professional adult match. Okay. In terms of what the average percentage serves in for, for an adult match. The key message, I suppose, where I'm getting to this in a roundabout way is that when we modify sport for children, we seem to observe that children start playing the game more like adults. They start displaying behaviour more like what we see with adult match play. So then if I had to just criticise my own research there, it's that a lot of that information I was told is purely based on performance, not learning. So I'm coming to the learning bit in a moment, if you like.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I know you have looked at how this can affect like implicit learning. What have you found there?
Yeah, I suppose the start of my postdoc actually, it was one of the big studies we did, and I wanted to see how children adapted when we give them different equipment. So we asked children to come into our lab, the biomechanics lab, and we gave half the children modified equipment, so a smaller racket and a softer ball, the other half a full-size racket and a normal tennis ball. They then played 340 forehands over a 2-day period, and we marked them up with Bicon markers and had cameras set up to measure the kinematics. And we wanted to see how do children adapt when given the different equipment. Now, once again, this study, we're finally just starting to analyse the data now, so I'll just touch on a few of the observations that we've seen. What we observed was that both groups actually showed similar improvements, so children found a way to adapt. But the way children improved seems to be different. So when children got the modified equipment, smaller racket, softer ball, they actually learned to get better whilst swinging the racket faster, okay, which is quite desirable from a tennis perspective. The other group who were using the adult equipment, they got better, but they actually got better while swinging the racket slower, okay, so they obviously adapted by swinging it slower. They also choked the racket more, so they held it, effectively shortening the racket. So that was some of the initial observations we've made. So in this study, when I took it on, the biomechanist, David Whiteside, said, this is a beast of a study. You don't realise how much Bicon data there is. And I'm like, no, it'll be fine. It'll be cool. I'll get through it. And anyway, it's taken a while to get through. So hopefully over the next few months, I'll start being able to find out or look at it in more detail.
That's really interesting. I like the kind of idea that skill finds a way no matter what you do, but there's a better way to do it, right? That's kind of a nice two sides of the coin. Yeah. Yes. Yeah,
I suppose I was going to say, I didn't really answer your first question then about the implicit explicit learning. The whole argument was that if we provide children with equipment that's easier to use, so we simplify the skill, that it should encourage a more implicit style of learning. Or probably a better way to think about it is if children use equipment that's too difficult to use, it might start encouraging a more explicit style of learning because, when something's more challenging, they might have to think about it more. In order to achieve the task goal. So that was our rationale for it. And hopefully in this study we'll be able to have an answer.
No, that's great. That's really interesting stuff. So I guess turning to another topic that I wanted to ask you about is your really great work you've done on working memory capacity and how it relates to an athlete's ability to implement instructions they get from their coach, for example. So maybe can you first tell, for people that don't know, what is working memory capacity and talk, a little bit about the research you've done on it?
Yeah, so I suppose working memory capacity, the easiest way to explain what it is, it's very much like short-term memory, but a little bit more complex. I think the best example I could give is doing a maths problem. So if you do a maths problem, I say 5 plus 5 divided by 2. In your mind, you go, 5 plus 5, that equals 10. You hold that information in your mind, divided by 2 equals 5. So that's working memory in action. You're holding information in your mind whilst doing something else. I quite like the definition of the controlled attention definition of working memory, actually, which is the ability to control attention in the face of distraction. I think that's got lots of applications to sport. And in terms of how it's measured, just to give you an idea of that, so a lot of my work's with children, so I use a task called the listening recall task. But all the tasks in working memory capacity are quite similar. It essentially involves trying to recall information whilst doing something else or whilst processing other information. So if I had to give you one simple example, the first sentence of in the test I do, it's you listen to a sentence, say whether it's true or false, and recall the last word. And I remember the sentence because I've listened to this test 1,000 times. The first sentence is, dogs have 4 legs. And so you would say true legs, the last word. Children or participants who have a larger working memory capacity can recall the last word of a lot of sentences.
Great. And then so you measure this ability in kids, and then how do you relate it to sport?
Yeah, good question. So we did a study recently which was looking at, so one of our arguments was that children with a lower working memory capacity might be disadvantaged in environments that I suppose promotes explicit learning. Because one of the arguments is that explicit learning involves working memory. So what we did was we did a study where we got 110 children. We divided them into a lower working memory capacity group and a higher working memory capacity group. And then we then asked children to learn a basketball shooting task. Okay. They did that over 3 days. But during that practice, we kept providing children with explicit instructions, lots of explicit instructions about how to perform the skill. Then we measured their retention of the skill a week later. What we observed was that the children with higher working memory capacity showed improvements from pre-test to post-test onto retention. But the children with a lower working memory capacity, they actually showed a decline in performance from pre-test to post-test to retention, which was quite interesting. So what I think is going on is that children with a lower working memory capacity, they selected poorer strategies to use the instructions. So they got the 5 instructions and they might have got overwhelmed, or they might have tried to use them all at once, and consequently it hindered their learning or their performance improvements. Whereas the children with higher working memory capacity, I dare say they were better at selecting, okay, I'm going to use that instruction to improve my performance, or I'll use those two. And that's what I think is going on, but I didn't actually test to see whether that was, that's what was going on. So that's just the study I've done, but certainly others have done some nice work more with, I suppose, skilled athletes. I quite like the work of Philip Furley and Daniel Memets. They've done a lot of work on working memory capacity and decision making. So things that they've found is that people with lower working memory capacity make poorer decisions when they're distracted or when they need to try and ignore or inhibit a coach's instruction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess what you do with this, there's kind of maybe 2 different paths. I know a lot of people look at training working memory capacity, right, to improve it, which I think what I've seen, that's fairly controversial about whether that works and has any impact. So I guess you could do that, or you could measure working memory capacity and just use that to guide your instruction of how you coach and things. Yeah. Well, so which one are you thinking about? Both of those, or kind of which?
I've definitely thought about both. I've definitely that both, and as you say, the improving working memory is quite controversial. Saying that, I quite like the work of David Murray in New Zealand. I think I've pronounced his name correctly. David Murray in New Zealand, who looks at learning motor skills as a means to improve working memory. But that's, I think, more so work. That's a different story. So we'll ignore that for now in terms of as a means to working with athletes. I think it's better to use, as you say, working memory as a means to understand how to deliver instructions better. And so if we're knowing working with an athlete that does have a poor working memory capacity, well then maybe there's a different way of going about delivering that information to him or her. But the idea of improving working memory is certainly an interesting topic, and I've been thinking more about that in terms of how sport can play a role, and I think there's lots of value there, particularly in children.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of that direction. I was thinking of improving working memory to improve sport, but you're right. The other direction could be equally or more important to life.
Well, as I started talking about it, I realized we're talking more about the sports scenario as opposed to just children's learning during primary school.
So kind of the last main topic I wanted to talk about research-wise was, some of the work you've done looking at contextual interference. And I think most people are familiar now with kind of the random practice idea and that it's beneficial because it creates this contextual interference. But I think a lot of people still are unsure or question the application of this when you go to real sport. Like, it works great in the lab where you control everything and you're doing boring tests. But when you take this onto the field, what value does this kind of contextual interference have? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I find this fascinating. I find it seems to be one of the most well-researched topics in motor learning. And yet, if I went to a coach and tried to provide advice on contextual interference, it's hard to give advice with confidence because, as you said, it's such a robust phenomenon. I can get that word wrong. With simple motor skills, being studied over and over again, but with complex sports skills, we still don't really know the answer. The findings are so inconsistent, and especially with skilled athletes. There aren't too many studies with skilled athletes, and so all of a sudden it's like, okay, many applied sports scientists are working with coaches who are working with skilled athletes. And despite it being such a well-researched topic, there isn't actually that much research on that population. So recently we want to try and help answer this question. And so we've developed a statistical metric to quantify contextual interference. Because, as you know, in most studies, it's either considered high contextual interference, random practice, or low. It's very much just in category. So we came up with a metric to measure between skill variability, which is simply how much a player switches between skills, so like a serve, forehand, backhand, and also within skill variability. So, serving on the outside, serving on the due side, kick serve, etc. So we can come up with a metric to quantify those two variabilities. And then from there, I suppose that provides an indication of the contextual interference in a naturalistic practice setting. Because one of the issues working with athletes is they're not going to change their training for an experiment. So we saw this as a good opportunity to try and measure contextual interference in practice, and hopefully we can use that to start assessing whether contextual interference is a variable that's influencing performance improvements. One thing we did observe in this is that, so when we look at, for instance, at the tennis academy where I do some work, we noticed that with serving, often they'll practice with low between skill variability, which simply means they're doing the serve in isolation. Now, the next question is does that benefit skill transfer, or does it hinder skill transfer? And I actually don't know the answer to that based on the current research that's been done. And so we did try and answer that question with an intervention with a younger age group, where we got a group to practice with moderate contextual interference, a group to low. But once again, like a lot of the other studies, it wasn't clear-cut the findings. There was some evidence to say that a high contextual interference was better for transference to match play, but it wasn't like it was the classic contextual interference effect. So that study is hopefully will be published soon, actually. But yeah, so to come back to your question, it's certainly an interesting topic. And I suppose one thing I'm hoping that we can, I feel like the only way we're going to answer this question is if, I suppose, multiple groups, applied scientists get together and actually, I suppose, collect data and end up pooling data together to have a large sample size, because one of the issues is it's hard to get large sample sizes with athletes. So I feel like if we can work together as a big group or as a big team, then we might be able to start answering this question of, does the contextual interference actually exist when working with skilled athletes? I can tell you my take on it at the moment and what I predict will happen, but I don't want to keep talking.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no, I was just thinking that sounds like a good registered study idea, right? Get lots of people. Yeah. But yeah, I really like that, because when you're talking, I was thinking, on the one hand, we talk about, random practice, which is mixing up different skills. And then we also talk about variability practice, which is sometimes people use that to mean varying the conditions within a skill. But we always kind of treat them separately. And I find people actually confuse them all the time. But it sounds like you're trying to put them basically, is that kind of, am I interpreting that right? You're almost putting those things together into one measure. Because they are getting at the same thing, right?
Exactly. So yeah, you end up with two, values for each, but essentially I look at it both as contextual interference. One might influence learning more than the other, but we'll only know that if we measure both of them.
Yeah, and I guess to finish off, let's follow through with your, some of your kind of thoughts on the value. What do you, we don't know yet, but what do you think about the value of it?
I'm starting to lean more towards this idea of, and it's been an idea for a long time, about practice specificity. And so in my mind, I wouldn't be surprised if we find that practice mirrors the contextual interference that occurs in match play. Then that's when we should see greatest transfer. That's what I predict will happen. I'm not sure if it's true or not, obviously, but that's what I think.
No, I think that's another good question. Like, in terms of random practice, I don't know if people have looked at kind of the sequencing of it, and do you practice serve, charge the net, volley, right? Or do you just in some meaningful way like you do in the game or something? Yeah, that's a good idea on that. So I guess coming back full circle to the blog, I wanted to ask you a fairly tough question. I know you've been reading lots of literature in skill acquisition and doing a really good job summarizing it. What do you see from getting this kind of big picture as kind of some of the big unanswered questions in the area? I think we just talked about one, but are there any other kind of ones?
Yeah, so the contextual interference one is certainly one of them, and that's obviously one that I've been focusing on myself, with my own research. I'd say the other, there's obviously lots of unanswered questions. That's the whole, that's science, isn't it? The other one which I'd love to have answered, who knows if it's the biggest unanswered question, but certainly working with, for instance, at the tennis academy where we're, working with athletes, we've been doing a lot of work on representative learning design, which I'm a big fan of. But at the same time, we still don't actually know if representative learning does lead to better transfer. A lot of the studies have been based on looking at a practice drill versus match play as opposed to an actual learning study. And so, and I suppose it comes down to, having appropriate transfer measures, as I know you've been talking about a bit in your podcast. But yeah, so I see that as a key issue because, and hopefully we'll actually answer it soon. One of the PhD student who I'm co-supervising, Lyndon Krause, is trying to answer this question with his final study actually. So yeah, I'm sure there are lots of other unanswered questions, but that's certainly the things which are on my mind at the moment.
No, I think those are really important ones. You're right. This kind of way science works is filling in these gaps. So I guess the very last question I have for you, Tim, is you already talked a little bit about this, but can you tell us a little about the research you kind of have in the pipeline or planned for the near future?
Yeah. So I kind of have touched on a bit of it. So my first couple of years in my postdoc was filled with lots of data collection, and so hopefully over the next year or so, some of that work will gradually come out. But so there's that study I talked about with scaling equipment and looking at kinematics and how children adapt. I'm really looking forward to trying to analyse that data, and hopefully that'll come out in I say months to come. Research, so it might take much longer. As well as the contextual interference work, I hope we can keep progressing some of that work. So I am keen to try and answer or help answer that question. And then, once again, I've already talked about this, but the representative learning design. So we're doing a lot of that work at the tennis centre. So simple things which, we observed tennis practice over a period of time, and we observed little things such as when tennis players practice the serve, for instance, often they don't have a returner, or often they don't actually practice the third shot after the serve. And so we're starting to think, okay, well, according to the representative learning design, that's not going to facilitate transfer to competition because we need to try and incorporate, what's actually going on in match play. So, yeah, they're a lot of the projects that are going on at the moment, and no doubt that'll probably be the projects that'll, I suppose, we'll try and publish over the next year or so.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of stuff. That's really good. I was involved in one of the first things you did with the representative learning design. So I think that's
you don't want to be the experts. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, I think that's going to be really good. This is really great, Tim. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
No, thank you very much, Rob. Much appreciated.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Tim. You can find out more about Tim's research from the links in the show notes, and definitely check out his skill acquisition blog if you haven't yet. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights, and find out more about the podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
Gone straight away.